Jesse Archibald Barber, Unsettling Truths of Reconciliation, Holocaust Imagery in Leonard Cohen's Beautiful Losers. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Yes, certainly I'd like to thank the organizers of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Research Showcase, the University of Regina, First Nations University, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 4 territory. So, the title of my talk, Unsettling Truths of Reconciliation, Holocaust Imagery in Leonard Cohen's Beautiful Losers. Now, certainly I'll be looking at Holocaust imagery in Cohen's novel, but my presentation also deals with a few other topics, one of those being truth and reconciliation. So I'd just like to quickly review the timeline of truth and reconciliation in Canada. If you recall, in June 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada issued an apology for the residential schools. And that same month, actually earlier that month, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. And it got off to a bit of a shaky start. The original committee was dissolved due to some conflicts, but then by about a year later in 2009, with Justice Murray Sinclair as the chair, the commission got underway. Fast forward to today, March 2014, 5 years later. And if you were unaware, the TRC held its final hearings this week. And so the statement gathering is now at an end. Doesn't mean it's over, it's still an ongoing process. But we can ask, where are we after 5 years, right? Has reconciliation been achieved? Many think, no, not quite yet. People are still optimistic, right? It's still an ongoing process. But some even ask, is reconciliation even achievable? And, there is a lot of optimism on that front, that, yeah, certainly reconciliation can be achieved, right? But there is a lot of skepticism about whether it can be achieved under the current mandate of the TRC. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And so we can look at the two aspects of truth and reconciliation. One being the truth of the TRC. Now, certainly the truth of Canada's past has been coming out, including statement gathering and document collection and witness testimonials, etc. However, the government has continually withheld thousands of documents about the residential school. And the TRC has had to take the government to court to obtain literally thousands of documents, literally hundreds of thousands of documents. Throughout the past 5 years, you may recall the odd news story where documents have been released, right, and where the court has ordered the government to release them. But even with those ones released, the government continues to withhold thousands of documents. So, we can, clearly, although the apology was issued and the TRC was formed, the government, we can ask, how committed is the government to the truth aspect of the TRC? There's also the reconciliation aspect of the TRC. And on the website related to residential schools, the TRC website has this as its mandate. The Commission views reconciliation as an ongoing individual and collective process that will require participation from all those affected by the residential school experience. This includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis former students, their families, communities, religious groups, former Indian residential school employees, government, and the people of Canada. Emphasis mine with the underline there. And I underline that just to make a distinction that there's two sides of the equation here, right? And it's understood that the survivors and their descendants have been actively pursuing reconciliation, right? And are on a healing journey. However, what's not been clearly demonstrated is whether the original perpetrators and their descendants are on their healing journey, right? The former employees, the government, and the people of Canada, right? Certainly a lot of Canadians are on the journey. Sorry? Oh, okay. Certainly a lot of Canadians are on their journey, or have joined Aboriginal people on their journey. But again, there's that widespread skepticism about just exactly how much. And so we have to explore why that is as well. And there are several reasons for that. One, it's a very difficult process for both Aboriginal people and Canadians. And looking at Leonard Cohen's novel, Beautiful Losers, he clearly recognized the difficulty of finding reconciliation for Canada's colonial past. Now, this novel, Beautiful Losers, came out in the 1960s. This was before he embarked on his career as a songwriter. And in it, he focuses on colonial genocide in Canada, among many other topics that he deals with in the novel. However, he also alludes to the Holocaust, and he often, in a few key places in the novel, he characterizes Canada's colonial past with Holocaust imagery. And it's somewhat perplexing, and of course it's anachronistic to do that. And it even, I think, rankles a lot of Canadians and a lot of readers when they see that. You're reading the book and it's depicting scenes in the 17th century Mohawk village, and then all of a sudden you get this Holocaust imagery, this Nazi imagery, right? And he's really, I think, doing that to emphasize the seriousness of the trauma that went on at that time when the missionaries first came in, the early conversions, right? All the way through the diseases that were introduced with colonialism. And it's one thing when we hear those stories, right? And often those stories are very easily dismissed, though, right? They're just stories of our past. So by characterizing it with Holocaust imagery, it gives pause to the reader, right? And makes them think about it. But certainly it's a difficult issue to unpack in the novel. And I certainly had difficulty doing it until I came across this work by Gabriel Schwab, Haunting Legacies, Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma. Now, in the work, she doesn't address Beautiful Losers or Cohen's work, and she doesn't really address Canadian history. She addresses, her main focus is on the Holocaust. She's a German writer, and she grew up in post-war Germany. And she describes her experiences growing up as what she calls a descendant of a perpetrator nation, right? And the conceptual framework that she outlines in her work, I think, really helps us unpack Cohen's novel. So before we get to Cohen's novel, I'd just like to briefly go through some of the key points of Schwab's conceptual framework. One of her main topics is transgenerational trauma. And she addresses how both victims and perpetrators pass on the ineradicable legacies of violent histories through generations, okay? And that's key to her work, right? That's one thing that makes her work, I think, unique, is that she's focused on both the victims and the perpetrators, right? One of the problems with reconciliation throughout many TRC commissions around the world is that they often just focus on one side. They often just focus on the victims without focusing on the need for the perpetrators and their descendants to heal as well, right? She emphasizes the entwined legacies of the descendants of victims and perpetrators, right? You can't have the healing of one without the healing of the other, right? And that all of our histories are entwined in this way. But still, there's difficulties in doing this, right? And Schwab recognizes this. She says, quote, "How do children of parents who lived through violent histories remember events they did not experience themselves?" Okay? So, we can certainly apply that to the situation in Canada. How do, the youth today, right, and many people today who are unaware of the residential school legacy, right? They're unaware of a lot of things that happened in Canada's past, right? Because they didn't experience it themselves, right? So it's something very abstract to many people. And even when, and you may have seen this yourself in your teaching, even when people are made aware of it, they often react with a kind of shock and dismay. And there's also feelings of guilt and shame that may arise, but those are kind of nebulous feelings because it's not something concrete. It's not a kind of guilt because of something that they did, right? So it's an abstract kind of guilt, and that's why it's very difficult to process. And again, Schwab recognizes this in her context in post-war Germany. She says, guilt is abstracted and inherited from a genocide experienced only secondhand. The German second generation finds itself in a sort of epistemological state of exile, left stranded on the other side of a history it does not know by an event it did not experience, cut off from the essential knowledge of what happened to their parents or what their parents did. Okay? So, obviously it's applying to post-war Germany, but, we can apply this to our situation in Canada as well. If you're, say, like the Canadian second generation, the Canadian subsequent generations, right? Cut off from the essential knowledge of what happened to their parents or what their parents did. Okay, so this is part of why why there's been that perceived lack of active participation in reconciliation on the side of Canadians. Now, one of the reasons why this is, just one of many reasons, is because the Canadian government's done a great job at hiding the past, right? And we can examine that by comparing the archive versus the concept of the archive versus the concept of the crypt. Now, the crypt is a negative way of dealing with the past, a negative way of recording the past and memorializing. The crypt, as Schwab says, people tend to bury violent or shameful histories. They create psychic crypts meant to stay sealed off from the self, interior tombs haunted by the ghosts of the past. It is the children or descendants who will be haunted by what is buried in this tomb. So again, this works for both victims and perpetrators, right? Original victims of abuse, right? It's something very painful and to deal with. And so people will often bury that trauma, right? Rather than dealing with it openly. And, so bury it away in what she calls a psychic crypt, right? And the crypt is something that, you put something in and then seal it off forever, right? Where there's no public access to it, right? The problem is those feelings and emotions experienced don't stay in there, right? They remain kind of living, right? But in a living dead sort of state. And it's in that way that people are haunted, by past violent experiences. And the same thing goes with the perpetrators of the original acts of violence, right? When you ask, like, how can people who did that, sleep at night, right, or look at themselves in the mirror? Well, it's by sealing those memories away in the crypt. And when the original perpetrators or victims don't deal with the trauma openly, they then invariably pass it on to others, right? Whether through lateral violence or through cycles of abuse, passing it on from one generation to the next. So Schwab says, in her context, until they face the ghosts of their own history and take responsibility for all the histories of violence committed under their rule, Europeans encrypt the ghost of Hitler in their psychic life. Of course, she's dealing with post-war Germany, so Hitler was the prime perpetrator of the Holocaust. And he's also representative of a kind of ultimate perpetrator in world history as well. So he's also a representative figure in that sense. But of course, we can apply this to the Canadian context, right? Like, until Canadians face the ghost of their own history and take responsibility for all the histories committed under their rule, Canadians encrypt the ghost of colonialism in their psychic life, or whichever you want to insert there. Okay. Now, we contrast this with the archive, which is a more positive way of recording the past and identity formation, right? The archive, and as Schwab says, decrypting or archiving, right? Or decrypting in the sense of prying open the crypt and bringing out all of that, past that's been hidden away, bringing it out into the open, and then properly examining it, talking through it, and filing it, and recording it. Decrypting allows the dead to rest and the living to gain freedom from their ghostly hauntings. Yet to achieve this freeing from the past requires one first to awaken the dead and to revisit the trauma. And of course, that's what happens in the TRC statement gathering, right? And if you've been to any of them, there was one of the statement gatherings was held here, and it was quite it's quite an emotional event. It's quite difficult. It's quite painful, right? And that's why people keep these things buried, because, bringing them out and talking about them, you have to relive that original trauma, right? But, there's an old Cherokee phrase, right? In order for the healing to begin, the poison must first be exposed, right? She goes on further, we could see cryptonymic writing more generally as an attempt to force the ghosts of violent histories into the open and work towards social recognition and reparation. And that's exactly what's required, right? That's the goal of the TRC, right? And the process moves from a notion of collective guilt to one of collective responsibility. So it's in that sense, those feelings, those abstract feelings of guilt, of course no one wants to carry that around, but the only way to get through that is to go through this process and move, instead of feeling guilt, of course, we can still embrace what's happened in the past, but it becomes a sense of collective responsibility, and that's that empowering feeling of liberation, right, that occurs, that one feels when going through this process, moving from the crypt to a proper archive. Okay, so again, before we get to Leonard Cohen, I found this interesting. Gabrielle Schwab gives a personal anecdote about her own history growing up in post-war Germany. She says, "My parents tell me that as an infant, I screamed every night for hours on end from the torments of hunger. They were also still crazed with terror from the war's killing their firstborn, their infant son, and leaving their house in smoldering ruins. Many years later, I befriended people, Jewish, French, Greek, upon whom my own people had brought war and genocide. I know the feeling of being the child of the enemy all too intimately. I also know what it feels like to belong to a people whose history has come to stand in the cultural imaginary of the world for evil incarnate." Okay, so she's talking about the experience of being the descendant of a perpetrator nation, right? She talks about the kinds of signs that were up around Germany. So this was a sign during Nazi rule. This one translates into Jews are unwelcome here. And she gives the text for the sign that was in her hometown of Tianjin. She says, "I was not born yet when the town addressed its Jewish population in this fashion, and too small to be able to read the Allied sign, but indirectly both signs passed down a legacy through Germany's cultural unconscious." Okay, so this was a sign that the Nazis put up. And then this is the Allied sign that she's talking about. This was the sign, this is the text of the sign that was outside her hometown. It says, and you can imagine after, of course, the Nazis were, the primary perpetrators of the Holocaust, but then once they were defeated by the Allies quickly then put up these signs, and in a sense turned the perpetrators into victims, right? Victimized the German people. And I mean, justly so for the full-on war criminals, right? But this also affected the children, right? And the subsequent generations of German people. So you can imagine driving, from France into Germany, and you would see this sign: "Here ends the civilized world. You are entering Germany. Fraternizing is prohibited," right? So in a sense, dehumanizing the German people, calling them savages, right? I've brought up a couple of signs here, and this one I find significant because this is a sign put up by the Canadians, by the Canadian allies. It's a Canadian soldier, and the sign reads, "Lest we forget, this is Germany, don't fraternize." and there's a cross there memorializing the Canadian war dead. Okay, so it really indicates that Canada does have a role in that violent history as well, and that's a connection there. Now, parallels in Canada, of course, there are some, and I've brought these up. Of course, parallel signs of division and segregation in Canada. We're all familiar with this sign. Notice this is an Indian reserve. Of course, this sign serves to demarcate and divide and segregate Native communities from Canadian communities, or at least they did in the past. This top picture, you can't read that sign, but it's a picture, back in the past of, people, average group of Canadians gathered in a public house, and there's a sign on the back of the wall, which of course excludes Indian people, right? No beer sold to Indians, and there are other more blatant, more racist signs as well. There were signs, just said no Indians allowed, right? So these kind of signs and were also going on in Canada as well, just as they were in Germany. I put this last picture here. Now, probably all familiar with this sign. It's a classic, iconic picture of Canada, right? It depicts that classic instance during the Oka crisis. We have a young Canadian soldier and a Mohawk warrior staring each other down, right? And I find this picture fascinating because you can see the intensity on both their faces, right? Well, you can see the intensity on the Canadian soldier's face, and even though the Mohawk warrior's face is covered, you can still get that sense of his intensity and the animosity, right, that he has. And what I also find significant about this is their age, right? Looking at how young that soldier is, and presumably how young the warrior is. Clearly, they were not old enough to be part of the generation of the original acts of violence in Canadian colonialism. They're descendants, right, of the original acts. And yet, although they're descendants of the perpetrators and the victims, you can still see how that animosity runs through into their generation, into their lives, and through each other. This picture is also significant because it took place in Quebec, near Montreal, and that is where Leonard Cohen's Beautiful Losers is set. Now, the setting is near present-day Montreal, or in that area, but has two time periods. The novel flips back and forth between modern-day Montreal, at least 1960s Montreal, and a 17th century Mohawk village, right, at a time when the Jesuits were just starting to come in and convert the Mohawk people. And there are four main characters in Cohen's novel. And so just to briefly go through them, they set up a kind of allegory of Canadian colonial history and identity. First, there is the narrator. Now, he's unnamed throughout the whole novel, so we just call him I. And he represents the English Canadian. And he lacks a definitive positive identity. And he struggles with this throughout the entire novel, right? He's tormented by the fact that he has no real identity and that he has a void within himself, and he struggles to fill that void. He ends up filling that void by identifying with whom he calls victims, right? And more on that shortly. There's also the character F, who is the narrator's childhood friend. They grew up together in an orphanage in Montreal, and he represents the French Canadian. Now, F dies in an insane asylum, and he speaks to the narrator from the grave through memories and letters. And then there's the narrator's wife, Edith, who represents the Aboriginal Canadian. And she has committed suicide by the time that the narrator's telling the story. But significantly, she was one of the few remaining descendants of the A's. And the A's are a native tribe in Canada, way, way back in Canada's past, that were all but wiped out with European colonialism. And this tribe, he becomes fascinated with this tribe. And he says, their brief history is characterized by incessant defeat. The very name of the tribe, A's, is the word for corpse in the language of all the neighboring tribes. There is no record that this unfortunate people ever won a single battle, while the songs and legends of its enemies are virtually nothing but a sustained howl of triumph. My interest in this pack of failures betrays my character. Okay, it betrays his characters because he wishes to identify with them. He wishes to identify with the victims of Canada's past. And when he comes across the A's, he sees them as kind of representative of the ultimate victims of Canadian colonialism, even to the point that they don't even have a name. Their name's been long forgotten, right? I mean, the letter A there, that wouldn't even be from their language, right? That's the first letter of the English alphabet, right? So their name's forgotten and even put under erasure. Now, what he did, of course, was there were, 4 or 5 remaining descendants of the A's still living in present-day Montreal, and he went and tracked them down, and then he wanted to identify with them so much that he even married one of them, right, Edith. Now, all of this is happening, F has died and Edith has died before the novel even begins, right? The novel is really the narrator recounting the memories of his wife and best friend, and also he's reading a long letter that he's received from F in his will, right, in F's will. After F dies, he's willed everything, his belongings to the narrator, and he's left him a long letter, right? Now, and he recounts how Edith committed suicide, again, an act of self-victimization, and he contemplates how he thinks that she did it to teach him a lesson, right? Because he was so obsessed with identifying with victims, she committed suicide in order to teach him a lesson that by doing that, he's actually re-victimizing the people and re-victimizing her over and over again, because he's turning real people into fictional victims, right? Or a kind of construct in his own mind, right? Okay, so I could go on about that, but I'll get bogged down and lost in that if we don't move on. Okay, yeah, but so after his wife commits suicide, and of course that devastates him, and of course that void returns, right? So he struggles again to fill that void, and to do that, he goes back even further back in time, and identifies with Catherine Tekakwitha, or Kateri. Now, Kateri is a real historical figure, and she was a very pivotal figure in Canada's religious past, and she represents what Peter Wilkins calls the ultimate Canadian victim. And in the past, she was called the Lily of the Mohawks, and she lived in the mid to late 17th century. And she's considered by many historians, I think Dennis Lee calls her the first Canadian of significance, right? Because she was the first colonial subject of any historical significance. And what he means by that is she's kind of representative of the first Christian convert, right? Now, there were people who converted to Christianity before her, but she's considered representative of that. And she's also considered an ultimate Canadian victim because on one hand because of her conversion, right? So from an Indigenous perspective, she's considered a victim because she forsook her traditions. But then she was also victimized by her own people for doing that very thing, right? She was ostracized from her community. But at the same time, she had this incredible power of resilience and healing. Her spiritual biographers at the time described how she was able to really transcend all of that victimization, right? Transcend all of the atrocities and the vicissitudes of Canada's past. And then when she passed away, miracles were recorded around her death, right? Her body changed color, it didn't decay. And then at her grave, when people would visit her grave, they would come away being healed, right? So all of these things were going on. And literally for centuries, Quebec, she became a major part of Quebec folk traditions, and people had been petitioning the Vatican to canonize her literally for centuries, and she eventually was canonized in 2012. Okay, so the narrator feels by identifying with her and even communing with her, and he even wants to marry her, right? That he can achieve that a more positive sense of identity. And at one point, he even says, "Oh world, let me be sick Indian," right? Let me be dreaming Mohawk. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. But back to this concept of decrypting past violence, right? And this dichotomy between perpetrators and victims. Now, the unnamed, and of course the crypt and the archive. The unnamed narrator is a historian who has been studying the crypts of Canadian colonialism, and he's been essentially prying open the crypt of past violent histories. And he struggles with the realization that he is a descendant of what Schwab calls a perpetrator nation. Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt,
Yeah.
but since you mentioned the Terry,
Yeah.
I actually have her card, which is called the Patroness of the Unborn.
Patroness of the Unborn. Yeah, thank you.
And there's a little prayer, if you want to say it.
Sure.
It's very interesting, that prayer.
Okay. Yeah. Sure, most certainly. I mean, she is an important person, right? Our Lady of Guadalupe, patroness of the unborn. That's right. Other parts of the world had actually already, canonized her as well, right? Places even as far off as Guadalupe. O Mary, bright dawn of the new world, mother of the living, to you do we entrust the cause of life. Look down, O Mother, upon the vast numbers of babies not allowed to be born, of the poor whose lives are made difficult, of men and women who are victims of brutal violence, of the elderly and the sick killed by indifference, or out of misguided mercy. Grant that all who believe in your Son may proclaim the gospel of life and with honesty and love to the people of our time. Right? I mean, that hits it on the head right there about how significant she is for the narrator, right? When you talk about, she's the patron saint of the unborn, but also the victims of brutal violence, right? And it's in that way, he wishes to identify with her victimhood, but also her sanctity, right? Her power to transcend all of that as well. Thank you, Angie. And it's that, of course, he turns to that because he's struggling with this, right? He's referring to, when he realizes he's a descendant of what Schwab calls a perpetrator nation, he's making reference to the Jesuit conversions, but also to residential schools, when he just openly says, I accuse the church of killing Indians, right? And at the time in the 60s when he wrote that was fairly controversial for him to just come out and say it like that. He's also stumbled on the truth about Canada, right? The plague. And this truth haunts him as he recognizes that a Holocaust lies at the beginning of Canadian history. Right? And the narrator's realization of this leads him to describe Katiri's 17th century Mohawk village as a Nazi medical experiment. Right? And this is where the Holocaust imagery starts to come in. Again, he does this really to kind of create that shocking moment for the reader, for the Canadian reader, because all of these things, it's as if, Canadians have been, they hear about these stories, but, maybe they're just, easily dismissed, they don't faze people, but when you then describe it as a Nazi medical experiment, it's like, oh, wait, right? You're reading about Canada's past, and all of a sudden it's characterized by fascism and Nazism. What's going on there, right? It's as if he used, it's not literally true that Canada's past was like a Nazi medical experiment. It's a figure of speech, but it does reveal a deeper truth. And in fact, it might be more literally true than we think. If we recall, I believe it was last August, some documents were pried out of the crypt, right, that revealed that the Canadian government were conducting medical experiments on residential school children. Right. So indeed, the residential school system, in addition to the mass deaths from disease, the schools amounted to a form of cultural genocide through education. Right. And, in a way, that information came out last August, but we didn't even really need to pry open the crypt to find that out, because this, the kind of genocidal policies were already in the open archives. Duncan Campbell Scott, for those of you who don't know, he was a Canadian writer, but he was also the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932. And in 1920, Scott wrote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill." DIA Archives. And then earlier in 1910, I think his most infamous statement, Scott also wrote, referring to the high death rates of Indigenous children in residential schools. So the government knew about it at the time, right? They said, he wrote, "This alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards the final solution of our Indian problem." Now, who does that sound like? Right? That could be, you might as well be reading Mein Kampf at that point. Change Indian to Jewish. And, you could even accuse Hitler of plagiarizing Scott at this point, right? And in fact, there is that close link between colonialism and Nazism. Schwab writes, "Historically, colonialism introduced the mechanism that allowed the colonizer to deny the subjectivity and agency of the colonized." Right, and Amy Césaire and Hannah Art, confirmed this. And then Schwab later writes, "The German Holocaust, even though unmatched in its cold, mechanistic, and industrialized machinery of death, draws on a relentless drive to subjugate or annihilate other people that reveals many affinities to Western colonialism and imperialism more generally." And that's kind of what becomes puzzling about, or significant about Cohen's use of Nazi imagery. Right? It's almost as if, the Holocaust is kind of the violent act in world history that trumps all other violent acts. I think people look at it that way. And because of that, it's almost, I know I speak for myself, it's almost a sense that like Nazism even predates colonialism somehow. Right, anachronistically. But in reality, it's the logical outcome of colonialism, right? It's all of the things that were being done in Canada really set up that model and laid down those lines that made this kind of action possible. So, on to the central topic of the paper. It took us almost 40 minutes to get there. But there are four main instances where Cohen uses Nazi imagery in the novel. The first one, which we've already gone through. And then, the second and third, I won't get into just for the sake of time, but they're really just comments on the totalitarian impulses that still carry through into modern society. But it's the fourth one that is the most disturbing and yet the most significant when we talk about reconciliation. And it's while vacationing in Argentina, F and the narrator's wife, Edith, bathe Hitler with the last bar of human soap. Okay. I'll let you all just process that for a moment. What the situation is that, of course, Hitler didn't really. Maybe we should all pause and process this for a moment. Not that I'm trying to encrypt the truth or anything, but yeah. I'll just give me my little coffee break here. Okay, what the scenario is that Hitler didn't, like in the fictional universe of the novel, Hitler didn't really commit suicide in his bunker in Berlin. And the burnt body that the Russians found, that wasn't really Hitler's body. He escaped with a bunch of other Nazis and Germans to South America, right, which is renowned for being a safe haven for Germans and Nazis after the war. And F and the narrator, they're having an affair, or the narrator's wife are having an affair, and they're vacationing in Argentina. And they discover Hitler working as a waiter in the hotel that they're staying in. Right. And when Hitler comes into the room, to bringing in the room service, there's a kind of surreal scene because they draw Hitler to the bed and they kind of have this bizarre sexual liaison with him, and then they all have a bath together, right? And Hitler produces this bar of soap, right, which is the last artifact of the Holocaust, right? It's a bar of soap that is derived from melted human flesh. And F was given the bar by Hitler, or Hitler left it behind in the room. And he has left it to the narrator in his will. And he says in the letter, "That bar is now in your hands. We are baptized by it." Right? And the idea is that when they were having a bath with Hitler, that they took the bar of soap and they washed him with it, right? And they covered him with that, with the soap, right? Which they covered him with his crimes, so to speak, right? And then they rinsed him off, right? And in a sense, cleansed him of it. Now it's a horrific symbol. I mean, it's almost the most horrific thing that an artist can think of in this context. Because the bar of soap symbolizes the collective atrocities of the Holocaust. Okay. But Cohen does something extremely profound with it. He transforms it into an object of spiritual cleansing. The bar of soap becomes what Schwab calls a transformational object, and she says these objects allow the emergence of repressed or refused mourning in order to facilitate both its psychic and narrative integration. Okay, and by psychic and narrative integration, of course, it's to actually be able to think through what is actually going on here. So, I mean, the scene continues because the next step is the concept of adoption, as part of reconciliation. I mean, what Cohen has done is he's imagined what's the most extreme perpetrator of world history, and what's the most extreme act of violence that one people have committed to another, and what would be the most horrific object or result of that, right? And then from there, is it possible to heal from that? Is it possible to find reconciliation? Is it possible to forgive the ultimate perpetrator? And the most ultimate act would be for the ultimate victim to embrace the ultimate perpetrator. And that's what happens next in the room. Now, after the bath, of course, he's toweled off and gotten dressed, and he's about to leave. And he's left the bar of soap behind, right, because he doesn't need it anymore. And F writes to the narrator, as Hitler opened the door to go, Edith threw her arms about his neck, pulled him to the dry bed, and cradled his famous head against her breasts. Okay, so that image there, right, bringing his head to her breasts, right, an image of, maternalism, but also a kind of adoption, right, bringing her to his breast, or bringing him to her breast. And there's also a sense, not only is she forgiving him, because remember, Edith is a descendant of the A's, right, representative of the ultimate victims of Canadian history, and she is forgiving the ultimate perpetrator of world history. And by him, and not only that, but the way it's depicted is that he's also accepting that forgiveness, right? So it's not just that, when perpetrator nations issue apologies, it's not enough to just say, I'm sorry, but one has to be willing to work through the act of being forgiven. And once Hitler leaves, F asks Edith why she cradled Hitler. And Edith replies, for a second, I thought he was an A. Okay, so it's that moment where she perceives the ultimate perpetrator as now being the ultimate victim. And also the very fact that she thought he was an A, she thought he was one of her people, right? One of her family in that sense. Now, in Schwab's context, this kind of act, of course, this scene is outlandish. It can be read as quite outlandish. And again, it can be even read as offensive to some people. Some people, like I said, it definitely rankles many people when they read that scene. It certainly unsettles them. But Schwab in her work, she discusses this kind of idea. She says, dehumanizing the enemy as a people is in fact what prepares the ground for turning warfare into genocide. Adoption, by contrast, works with a different logic, according to which, as human beings, friend and enemy become interchangeable. So, she recognizes that this can seem like an impossible task, and maybe it is literally impossible, because, of course, many people are not willing to forgive, and that's quite understandable, and I think that's their right. And she recognizes that. She says, such an act of imagination would transcend a binary structure of thinking and feeling along the divide of victim and perpetrator, or friend and enemy. It would be an imagination that sees histories of violence as systemic and destructive to both sides. Mourning must then be envisioned in conjunction with a redress that encompasses both victim and perpetrator. Any redress aimed at breaking the cycle of violence presupposes imagining the enemy, and indeed the perpetrator, as a human being, right? Now, in these extreme cases, of course, if this task appears to be larger than human, it is because it requires not only a new ethics, but also a profound rearrangement of desires and affect. And I think that really, there's the rub, right? In any nation that has violent histories. When we think about Canadians and how willing they are to actively engage in the process of reconciliation, it's, I think, this that holds a lot of people back, needing to make a profound rearrangement of desires, right? And this is why Cohen, gives us such an extreme example with the cleansing of Hitler. If one can work through that, right, one can reach reconciliation for almost any act. It's also why he describes this idea as attaining whole communion with a saint, right? So he doesn't consider it an impossible task. He more poetically refers to it as a remote possibility. because by communing with the saint, with Kateri, that he hopes at least that will give him the power to transcend that divide between perpetrator and victim. And the goal, of course, is to reach a meaningful politics of reparation, right? Schwab says, we need a meaningful politics that crosses the divide between victims and perpetrators. Cohen more poetically puts it, do not be magician, be magic, right? And just to wrap up here, I mean, where does this lead us? This leads us to the process of decolonizing the mind, right? Because, as Schwab says, among the legacies unwittingly inherited by future generations is to take responsibility for the violence committed by the parental generations. So that's not only the youth generation today, but also the generations still to come, right? And that it's our responsibility, right? It's not about collective guilt, it's about collective responsibility. And she follows Frantz Fanon's stages for the liberation of victims. Now his work, of course, is more based in South Africa, and he sets phases for decolonizing the mind of the descendants of victims. But Schwab uses that model and adapts it to for phases for decolonizing the mind of the descendants of perpetrators, right? But I think all these phases work for both sides. Now, they're kind of phases, and it's not like it's some set order or anything, but and they all have their kind of pitfalls, but they're all important. You know, when we talk about identification with the victim, what she's talking about there is empathy, right? You know, for Canadians to really empathize with residential school survivors, to understand their stories and to listen to their stories. And that those stories don't just end just because the TRC ends this week, right? Those stories will continue to go on for as long as they live. So there's that sense there. Of course, the pitfall is to kind of identify too much, like the narrator did, and kind of romanticize the other. But that, you know, that's not what she's talking about here. She's talking about straight up, just simply empathy. Then, of course, there's the unilateral rejection of anything identifiable with colonial or racist culture. And of course, that's been going on for a while now. And certainly, you know, the University of Regina, for instance, with the indigenization plan, right, is attempting to decolonize the academy, right, and remove any kind of remaining vestiges of colonialism. And of course, here, I mean, this building here is all about that as well. We've been doing that for a while now, over 30 years, over 36 years of indigenizing the academy, and of course our curriculum is already decolonized, or at least for the most part. The work's never really done. It's always a process of becoming, right? You never really reach perfection, but it's still something that's going on. And of course, you know, there's always things that creep in, and that still continue. But this is the goal. Idealizing fixation on the other's pre-colonial heritage, simply, you know, I think, just the idea of reclaiming traditions, right? Which, again, we're certainly doing here. You know, the Department of Languages, by reclaiming languages and preserving them, right? Indigenous health studies, right? Faculty in that department gave presentations earlier this week on reclaiming traditional Indigenous foods and medicines, right? And so that kind of work. All of the work, Indigenous fine arts, even English, right? Although, English, and literature in English, of course, English language is the colonizer, there's still that sense, and, most Native writers will tell you that those traditions, those pre-colonial traditions still carry through into English, despite they carry through the translation and the changes in time. But it's this fourth one that I think is most important. And, when I talked earlier about that there is optimism about reconciliation, and I think a lot of Canadians, especially young Canadians, are certainly open and want to get to this place. And that's the acknowledgement of one's conflicted identity as participant or inheritor of a violent legacy, and willingness to assume responsibility and participate in the collective struggle against oppression, violence, and war. And I think a lot of us are already there, and certainly a lot of us are wanting to be there, right? And that's just going to grow more and more as we go further. So when we imagine Canada's future, of course, which is the theme of this research showcase, I like to hold on to this last one here, right? Imagining Canada's future as we move and the new generations continue to come. I think that this really encapsulates a good place of where we are and where we need to move to. Thank you for, thank you.